If you work at a public service desk within the public libraries system, you're asked all kinds of questions every day. It may be very simple questions like where's the fiction section or where's the bathroom even, but you're also asked complicated questions, maybe information about an author or a title or a complex question. I've been asked, I need an explanation of the theory of relativity or something very difficult like that. So you're often called to answer very complicated or provide answers to very complicated questions. In library school, any interaction between a patron looking for information and a librarian trying to help them to find it is called a reference interview. And what we're going to do in this class today is to talk about some of the techniques for helping you to find answers for your patrons. To begin with, one reality today is that people don't come to the reference department or to a library to find answers for a question first. They go to the internet, and they very often come to you or to me when they haven't been able to find the correct answer, or they found too much information or something like that. We're not the first stop anymore, so we don't get as many of these questions, but very often they're more complicated and they're harder questions because they could have found the easy things on the internet. And also, you'll find that patrons don't always ask for what they really need or want. Now that sounds strange, and why is that? Well, for one thing, they can't always remember the details. They've heard something on television, they've heard a couple of friends talking, or they've seen something on the internet a week or two ago that sounded interesting, but they can't remember a lot about it. They've forgotten some of the key terms, and they expect you to help them to find those key terms. I know I work with authors and titles every day, and I can remember books from 15 or 20 years ago and refer patrons to them. But when I go to a bookstore, I'm as bad as any patron. I can't remember authors and titles. You know, I go to a bookstore, what's that book about the girl who's picked to fight the other people? Oh, I can't remember. You know, Susan Collins's Hunger Games. I actually did that right at the beginning of the Hunger Games craze, and I could not remember the author and the title. I went to a bookstore to buy the book. Just like a patron coming to the library, I could not remember that information. Along the same lines, sometimes patrons don't understand the topic, or they don't know the correct terms. Maybe something to do with a medical question or a legal question. Their doctor has talked to them about something, and they remember some of it, but don't remember the key term, the key medicine, or the name of the illness or disease, and they're expecting us to help them to find it. Another issue may even be that they're embarrassed by the question. It may be something that's very personal, and they don't know you, and they're asking you to help them to find information. A librarian that worked here for many years had a story she often told about an older man who came in one day, and all he would say is, I'm having some problems with my wife. And she kept asking questions, and he just wouldn't go any further than that. She finally decided that he was looking for a sex manual. And she went and got a couple of books, brought them back to him. He left, and the story ends the way she always told it. He came back in a couple of weeks and said, oh, it worked like a charm. Well, that's a funny story, but you can tell he was very embarrassed. He did not want to talk about this, but he also needed assistance. So she was very good in figuring out what he wanted and finding his answer, really without asking any questions. There's a really good site about how to learn more about the reference interview that comes from the Ohio Library Council. You can really Google Ohio Library Council and reference interview and find that site. It's a very in-depth site that takes you step by step through how to conduct a reference interview. And what I'm going to be doing today in the next couple of minutes is really condensing that down. The acronym that's used these days to describe the reference interview is WORF, W-O-R-F, and that's easy to remember because it's a character from Star Trek, The Next Generation. So remember WORF. WORF stands for welcoming, open-ended, repeating, and follow-up. And let's go through those step by step. Welcoming, well, that's fairly obvious. Make the patron feel like you care about helping them. Now, it may be time for you to go to lunch or go home, but the patron doesn't know that. So be welcoming, maybe even smile. Listen closely. Be very open. I had worked with a reference librarian that used to lean forward while she was talking with them to kind of engage them like they were in a conversation to make them feel comfortable in being welcome. The key part of WORF is asking open-ended questions. Now, before I talk about open-ended questions, I also tend to ask what I call establishing questions. And those are questions to help me find out a little bit about what level of knowledge the person has, what they need. Questions like, is this a class assignment? Are you doing this for a hobby? Are you a graduate student or an undergraduate student? There can be any number of establishing questions to get a sense of what level of knowledge this patron has and what they need. Do they need 2 pages printed from the internet, or do they need 10 books and 20 magazine articles? So establishing questions can be asked right at the beginning. But the key part is to ask open-ended questions. Now, an open-ended question is one that forces the patrons to open up and tell more about what they're looking for. A patron comes in and says, I'm looking for information about Chevrolets. Well, I respond back, are you looking for repair information? No, I'm not. Well, I haven't really advanced the question at all. I've asked a closed question, a yes or no question. It would be very easy to say, well, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're looking for about Chevrolets? And then you can perhaps get to the point. Another example might be somebody coming in, I'm looking for books on World War II, a huge topic. And you might want to say, well, that's a big topic. What are you looking for about World War II? Well, I'm looking for a biography of General George Patton and his career during World War II. So try to ask questions that get the patron to tell you more about it. And as they tell you more about it, they'll very often remember more pieces of information about it. Also, restate the patron's answer back to them to make sure you understand it and to make sure they know that you understand it. The question about General Patton may be, so let me understand, you're looking for a biography of General Patton. This was an example of something that I did recently, and the patron said, well, no, I'm actually looking for information about someone who worked on General Patton's staff, and they've just written their memoirs. Well, he didn't say that right off, but we were able, by restating the question, to take the question further and to get closer to the answer. The F part of WORF is to follow up, and that's not always possible. But if you leave a patron, try to come back to him in a couple of minutes and say, well, is this what you were looking for? Is this the correct information? If they say yes, that's great. If they say no, then you can continue to ask them questions to find out more about what they're really looking for. Here's a real example of something that happened a couple of months ago that I thought was kind of interesting, and it uses some of the parts of WORF to provide an answer. A young woman who was probably in her early 20s came in and asked a question that she had read a book while she was in school about a young girl living through dust storms. She didn't remember the author, didn't remember the title. She liked the book and wanted to read it again. In fact, she wanted a friend of hers to read about it. So could I help her find what this book was? Well, we didn't have a whole lot of information to go to. But I kind of thought it might be on a reading list. So I asked a couple of establishing questions. I told her, did you read this as part of coursework, or did you just find it in the library and find it interesting? She said, well, I think it was part of schoolwork. Since I thought it was maybe on a summer reading list, I said, well, do you remember reading it during the school year in class, or did you read it during the summer? And she said, well, I read it during the summer because I remember I read it on vacation. So almost certainly it was on a reading list. Now, we could have gone to a Huntsville reading list and perhaps found out about it, but reading lists change. She had read this a number of years ago, and reading lists often books are added and deleted, so we didn't know. I asked one more establishing question. I asked her, do you remember what grade you were in or what school you were in? She had mentioned in her question that she had gone to school in Huntsville. She said, well, I think it was Huntsville Middle School. So that was probably the 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, and that was probably 8 or 10 years ago, so that the reading list could have changed. But I was almost certain it was a book on a reading list. Well, I asked a couple of open-ended questions. I asked her to describe more about the book, what she could remember about it, and she said it was about a young girl living through dust storms, living on a farm and going to school in a small town. And every year these terrible dust storms would come and blow for day after day, and she was writing about her experiences living through those dust storms. Well, that sure sounded like the Dust Bowl in America in the 1930s. I asked her, did the girl live in the U.S.? And she said, well, I don't know. So that didn't get me any further on that. I asked her some other questions. Tell me a little bit about the story. Tell me some things about it. Were they driving cars? Were they riding horses or in a horse and buggy? Were they on the internet? Were they listening to the radio or watching television? And she said, well, they were driving cars because they got caught in a dust storm one time. And she also remembered that the family used to gather around the radio every night and listen to radio shows. Well, that sure sounded to me like the Dust Bowl in America in the 1930s. I asked her, is there anything else you could remember about the way the book was set up or structured? She said, well, it was in the form of letters. And when she was describing the dust storm, she often wrote about them using poetry. Well, she hadn't said anything about that, and that was very distinctive. So at that point, I thought I had enough information to try to find an answer. 20 years ago, I would have gone to a book like Fiction Catalog or Children's Catalog and looked up information. These were books to help you they have brief descriptions of different kinds of books, and I could look under Dust Bowl and young adult literature and maybe find the book that way. But we've got the internet. Why not use that? Well, I did a Google search, and I forgot exact terms I put in, but I put in young adult, girl, Dust Bowl, poetry, reading list, and the very first thing that came up was a book by Karen Hesse, Out of the Dust. And I clicked on the link. It was a young adult website. It was a book review of the book, and it says it was about a young girl growing up in the 1930s in Oklahoma and experiencing these horrible dust storms. So it sure sounded like that. And I read a little bit further. The book was written in the form of letters, and what was so distinctive about it was that she often used poetry to describe the dust storms. Well, that was almost certainly the book that we were looking for. So I looked it up in our catalog, and we had a copy in our young adult collection. I sent her downstairs and told her to call me back one way or the other. Let me know whether that was the book or it wasn't. If it wasn't, we would keep on searching because we had some other possibilities that popped up on the internet. She called back in a couple of minutes, and that was the book. So we were able to find that particular book with very little information by asking establishing and open-ended questions and getting her to drawing her out and helping her to remember more and more about the book that she had read so many years ago. To me, that's kind of fun. It's like kind of putting pieces of a puzzle together. In fact, that's probably why I got interested in being a librarian, because I really liked using my knowledge to help people to find information and to find answers. And maybe you like that too. We don't answer as many questions as we used to, but if you use WORF, and remember the terms, welcoming, ask open-ended questions, restate the patron's answer, and follow up if you can probably find answers to almost anything the patron needs. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Never hesitate to call me or to call someone in the reference department if you have a tough question, and we can figure out perhaps the answer to it by using WORF. And to me, like I say, it's a lot of fun. It's like solving pieces of a puzzle. So I hope this has been helpful, but please do contact us if you need help. Thanks.
All right. That was great. Okay, hold on just a second. Don't leave yet.